I'm a better person for having sat where you're sitting throughout yesterday. And there was some really interesting commonalities and themes and narratives running through the presentations. And I hope, in my own small way, that I can contribute to that and be part of something that you all take away from these couple days. I know less than almost everyone you've heard from. I'm not an advertising expert or anything like that. I have a relatively straightforward story to tell because I happen to just have ended up working for Barack Obama very early. I grew up working for Senator John Kerry, so the two people I've worked for are now the President and the Secretary of State, so that's an interesting kind of vantage point. But I'll jump right in. I'm going to go relatively quickly. And I'll be around throughout the rest of the day should anyone wish to grab me. Anyway, so let's jump in. Some very basic themes were laid out at the beginning of the first campaign. Some of these are going to seem relatively kind of pedestrian and even somewhat naive now because I'm asking you to rewind 6 years to 2007, pre-smartphone. So if you can divest yourself of the last few years of technological advances and get back to that. Some of the earliest values that our campaign was based on were the result of the fact that we were starting with nothing. We had no institutional advantage. We were up against Senator Clinton in the primary, so we were running against a very well-established brand that had 2 decades of momentum, and we didn't. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about we were capable of and even forced to do because we started with nothing. And in fact, that can be quite liberating. So self-organized relationship marketing and personalization, we wanted to build this from the individual out. We were going to do everything we could to give people the tools to self-organize, to reach out to their colleagues, their neighbors, their friends, their family, and build it from the individual out. And you'll see that hopefully as we go along. Relationship marketing is just a different kind of more macro way of thinking about that same idea, giving people the tools to reach out and activate people that are already in their lives. And personalization is something that I'm going to come back to again and again, especially as we get into the second campaign. Because in an age where there's hundreds of millions of dollars being thrown at people to try to get your attention, if you can actually reach out to them in a personal context, it tends to penetrate that media tornado much more effectively. MyBarackObama.com was our online organizing tool, and I'll speak a little bit about how that is built in the next slide. Media, as you all know, paid advertising. New, which was our umbrella term for social media, since we looked upon it as broader than just kind of social media. Free, which is going around doing events, rolling out policy initiatives, and basically trying to get news coverage that represents what you would have paid had you bought that time on television, had you bought that space in a newspaper. And surrogates, strategic and intelligent use of people other than the candidate that can go out into media markets and demographics and validate Barack Obama and the policies and the vision that we had for America. As we get into the second campaign, I'll talk a little bit about data, owning it and building it and testing it and analyzing it. That's probably the key takeaway and the key difference between the two campaigns, mainly because we didn't have much data in the first campaign because, again, we were starting with nothing. Harmonizing, I'm personally wed to because that was, in a sense, my job. I would be out in a city 7 or 10 days before Barack Obama, and I would be orchestrating everything from our paid media to the political outreach to the neighborhood, to the door-to-door outreach in that community, getting ready for his visit. When I say starting with nothing, I share a couple images like this because it's important to kind of rewind and remember back to a day when we were still introducing ourselves. And this is early 2007, and I share this also because you'll notice we're alone. There's no security, there's no Secret Service. I am less gray, he is less gray. So I hope you believe me that this is actually 2007. Also, The two earliest states in American presidential politics, which are Iowa and New Hampshire, are so rootsy that if you on Tuesday were going to buy some apples and pumpkins, you could also spend an hour and a half with Barack Obama. That's how organic and local and rootsy these efforts start in the United States in presidential politics. Now, here's a backyard in Iowa, so you can see a lot of corn. And our goal in this is not just to reach out to potential supporters, but to reach out to them and give them the tools to become organizers. We tried to look at every individual as a potential organizer, and we did that by getting them to sign up and be activated on MyBarackObama.com. The way this worked was just how you sign up for a free email address or anything else. Your name, your zip code, some basic kind of demographic stuff. And then you could import all your contacts into this. And as you'll see, there's events I've created, events I'm attending, access to news and articles. Now, access to information is obviously not new, but the initial tool that we built into this was that people could actually build events and actually reach out to their neighbors and getting back to that idea and making that idea real of self-organization and personalizing the campaign. We were saying here, if you think we should be doing more on nursing issues, go off and build an event where you gather nurses together and talk about it. Small business owners, teachers, veterans, anything like that, fill in the blank. You yourself could say, I'm going to increase our visibility and our involvement in a particular issue. Things started to grow. Now this is 500, 600, 700 people. This is in a gym in Iowa. This is still February of 2007. But the same data collection chores are there, the same goals. We're trying to reach out to each one of these people. We're trying to get them involved and get them activated before they leave that building and not look at them just as a supporter that needs to be persuaded, but looking upon them as an organizer that needs to be activated. Roughly once a quarter, we would do large events in each of these early states that would organizationally give us something to build towards. So all of those little backyards, all of those little house parties, once a quarter we would try to build towards a relatively large, what I would call TV-worthy event. And this also gets into the free media component of what I mentioned at the beginning, because if we do this job well and it's an attractive visual, it gets used by television stations, and that's tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of free media. And events like that are specifically what I was responsible for putting together and harmonizing with all my colleagues. Low dollar donors, again, people know this now, but they were an incredibly important part of our first campaign, a very critical source of revenue. We looked upon each as creating a relationship with people rather than soliciting donors. And again, those online tools would come into play so that we weren't just treating them as a single conversation, but inviting them in to help organize. We also realized there was a seamless connection between our low-dollar donors and our volunteers. We learned very quickly that someone who was willing to volunteer 5 or 10 hours a week was also willing to give $5 or $10 or $20. And so the two universes actually kind of became one, and that was really interesting. A very low cost to donation ratio. Up to this point in American politics, fundraising would take place in a ballroom like this. A couple hours of the candidate's time, long drawn out direct mail campaign, when in fact we revolutionized how you could do this online with MyBarackObama.com, we added onto it a fundraising tool so that people could start to charge $5 for a barbecue in their backyard, things like that. Again, bringing them deeper into being involved in the campaign, giving them the tools to reach out. Now we're growing even more. This is in Ybor City in Tampa, Florida, about 3,000 people, and this is also $20 a head. So not only are we able to get a crowd like this is on a Sunday, but also along the back, you can't see it, are 8 or 10 camera crews. So if we have probably a fifth of these people activated on MyBarackObama.com, our goal is to probably enlist and activate another. And then each of those starts to become a pyramid where they're organizing their neighbors and their colleagues. And then the 8 or 10 camera crews along the back, say for example, maybe 100 or 150,000 viewers per television station, all of a sudden our little 3,000 person event in the courtyard of this Cuban social club is reaching a couple million people over the next 48 hours. And this is, again, still quite early. Another thing that we came up with was combining old media and new media. We would take an event like that, and as people filed in, we would give each person a sheet of paper with the name and number of 5 uncommitted voters in the state. And right before Senator Obama would take the stage, we would have someone get up and say, okay, everyone, pull out your phones and call your 5 names, and boom. In 10 minutes, we would also ask them to text 5 friends within the state. We would make, if it was an audience of 5,000 people, we would make 50,000 touches in 10 minutes, 25,000 of them being new people that the campaign hadn't touched before. It was free, it was personal, it required absolutely none of the principal's time, and all of it, again, coming back to that idea of self-organizing. Now, that's combining old and new. This is straightforward, new, hungry outreach. An established campaign with an established brand never would have embarked on something like this. So if you were playing PlayStation with your friends, and you were in a state where early voting had started, we were buying ad space on video soccer games. We were buying ad space, obviously, in PlayStation hockey, car races, anything like this. No one had ever done this before, and I honestly believe that if we hadn't started as hungry and with virtually nothing, I don't think this level of risk-taking and creativity would have actually surfaced in our organization. And that gets back to my point about how liberating it is, really, to start with nothing. Mrs. Obama also became very active halfway through 2007. So you can take everything I just talked about, multiply it, maybe not by 2, but at least by 60 or 80%. She's out drawing 3,000 and 4,000 people. We're doing data collection at that with our volunteers, signing those people up onto MyBarackObama.com. So that's a whole nother level of activity that is up and running. We started by the end of 2007 to get high-profile endorsements. Oprah. One of the demographics that we were very weak with was older white voters, so there was no better validator or someone to go out to older white voters in America at the time than Senator Kennedy from my home state of Massachusetts. And then all the events he would do, we would have volunteers there doing data collection and engaging people, and you can see the plan by now. By the time that we were getting towards the end of 2007, we were starting to get some decent momentum. I remember Googling our campaign when I signed up in January of 2007. The 3 words that came up when you Googled Barack Obama in early 2007 were unlikely, improbable, and long shot. So, but by the end of that year, we were starting to see crowds like this. And not only crowds like this, where we would do everything that I just talked about in terms of the data collection and activating people, but these are all the people that couldn't get in. So I essentially had to start having 2 whole different teams. One to do everything that I just talked about inside the event, and another whole team to deal with the 3,000 or 4,000 people that were outside that didn't get in. Another opportunity to collect data, another opportunity to reach out to people, another opportunity to engage them. On into the general election, running against a very honorable gentleman named Senator John McCain. He made the mistake, unfortunately, of saying that he wasn't even comfortable using email. And so for us, once we had gotten over the primaries with Senator Clinton, it for us gave a very clear generational kind of dynamic to the race. As soon as you're talking about experience and accomplishments and resumes, as Senator McCain did, and I would venture to even jump forward and say as Governor Romney did, you're automatically talking about yesterday. And leaders are supposed to be ambassadors of the future, I think. And optimism, hope, and change are fundamentally about tomorrow. You can't be optimistic about yesterday. You can't hope about yesterday, and you can't change yesterday. So that dynamic is how it played out, and fundamentally kind of in a pithy way, 20th century versus 21st century. So let's move on to the most recent campaign. We also by then had Senator Biden on our ticket, so a whole nother universe of activity, a whole nother universe of contacts, activating people, getting them involved. You might have heard or remembered about all the different internet rumors about Senator Obama. Horrible things that reflect the underbelly of American politics. we took that initial online tool and we said, here's a tool that you can A, share that internet rumor with us, and B, we'll give you a response tool to go back and share with your friends and try to dismantle this and kill it in the crib. Now, we're towards the end of that first campaign. Clearly, we're not in the cornfields anymore. Clearly, we're not in people's living rooms anymore. This is 100,000 people, but every single thing that I've talked about in terms of our organizational approach to these events is taking place here. This is 100,000 people. We had 3,000 or 4,000 volunteers ringing this, and then with 35 camera crews there, again with the same ratio of 150,000 or 200,000 viewers, and if we activate a fifth or a third of that crowd over the next 72 hours, and especially with that being such a compelling visual picked up by wire services all over the world, that image is going to reach probably 500 million people in one form or another in the 48 hours after this event. This is us doing what we do at the absolute kind of height of our skills, and we won. I share this picture because campaigns to me are the courtship, and then governing is the marriage. So gone is no longer are people projecting or hoping what they want to see, and we have to produce some very concrete achievements: healthcare, the bank bailouts, Recovery Act, and I'll ask you to pay particular attention to the auto bailout because that's going to be very important as we get into the fall of the re-election year. This is just a brief example. These are all permanent online presences on behalf of the White House. In fact, just yesterday, the First Lady did a Google Plus hangout, but these are all living and breathing and being constantly fed in terms of outreach and having the White House stay connected. This is the night before the midterm elections. I somehow always end up with him the night before elections, where we got shellacked. It's not uncommon, especially in the first term of a United States president, that they lose seats in the midterm election. And this is similar to the first campaign, where people started to discount us in terms of re-election, but being down and being discarded and being underestimated was by then familiar territory. So none of us got rattled. So that brings us into the re-election campaign. I again apologize for going very quickly, but I want to try to give you this kind of arc in 25 minutes. Some of the challenges combat the historical trend of defeat during economic stress. We had 8% economic unemployment in the United States. No modern president had ever been reelected with that, and that fed into the idea that we were dead in the water, that fed into the idea that we were ripe for plucking. We wanted to maintain the hunger from the first campaign while still being presidential, which is an interesting balance to still be hungry and forward-leaning while still having the kind of accoutrement and the responsibilities and the context of the presidency. Keep pace with technological change, that's obvious. We couldn't do in 2012 what we did in 2008, just like whoever's going to run in 2016 can't do what we did in 2012. We also knew we had to develop a consistent macro message that would be micro-delivered through relationship-based social media, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. And then due to a court decision that basically opened the gates to unregulated corporate money, we also knew we were going to be up against at least $500 million in unregulated super PAC funds spent attacking us by our opponents. So if any of you want to take your brand and think of what $500 million would do to it, you can chew on that for a little bit. But that certainly, shall we say, clarifies one's sense of priorities going into the re-election. Micro campaigns. We knew certain parts of the country were going to have the potential for certain emphasis that we could do that would localize the campaign a little bit more. The auto bailout, which was the government involvement in saving Chrysler and General Motors, billions of dollars, which I will share has been repaid with interest by now. In Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin, obviously everyone knows, I think, the importance of Ohio. The Latino vote in some of the most rapidly changing states in the country, Nevada, Colorado, Ohio, Virginia, Florida. In Florida, for example, there were 225,000 new voters in 2012 that weren't there in 2008. all ripe territory for us to go out and do all the things that I mentioned. Women's issues, for whatever reason, the Republican Party has in the United States, has a fascination with yesteryear. And as soon as you're talking about returning to traditional roles and things like that, there's a lot of code that's woven into that. And I think when you boil it down, it's the idea of returning to when people knew their place. And I think I'm proud to say we're past that, but that's not to say that some people aren't fascinated with trying to return to it. And then surrogates. We had any number of high-level people running around the country on our behalf: Bruce Springsteen, George Clooney, Eva Longoria, and President Clinton, all extremely effective, going out, doing events, along with all the data collection and the activization on myBarackObama.com that I've already talked about. Our new media starting line, we started 2012 with 14 million email addresses, 12 million people on Twitter, and 25 million people on Facebook. Our opponent, who had ran in 2008 and had continued to, who basically had been by now running for 6 years, had 1.5 million people on Facebook and 375,000 people on Twitter. In broad strokes, there's about 55, 60 million Democrats in the United States. There's about 55, 60 million Republicans. If you think of it, we've signed up a quarter of the Democrats, and Mr. Romney had signed up, what is that, 2%, 3%? And I think that, to me, speaks to how much does your organization really want to engage people? Do you want to just have a few social media tools so that you can say you have them? Or do you really want to engage in a conversation and listen to people and get feedback and engage in a relationship? The new media challenges for us are, again, taking those, micro-targeting the macro message in some of those regions that I talked about, in some of those demographics like I talked about. Create applications that learn behavior. This is what Facebook does, it's what Google does, trying to learn as much as you can possibly know about people's online habits and how they like to access information, what they click on and what they don't, what they respond to and what they don't. Be even more agile and more nimble than we were at the beginning, trying to hold on to that initial hunger and sense of the underdog, which I think is healthy as an organization. Keep pace with portability. One of the main themes from yesterday is how untethered people are from the desktop. So we had to revamp a lot of our social media outreach to go towards the mobile device as opposed to people sitting at their computers. And we also updated MyBo. We were constantly updating MyBo. That's our affectionate nickname for MyBarackObama.com. And our goals were to start a conversation with persuadable voters long before Election Day. I've talked about the agility. And then jumping to the end, we built a quick donate SMS tool, which once you had given your credit card information to the campaign, you could be getting texts right after a big speech, right after a big event, right after a debate, and you could just respond to the text by responding 5 or 10, and that would be a $5 or a $10 donation. And we also developed metrics for and from everything. We measured everything. And one of our mottos, one of my mottos, was data is the compass and analytics is the map. And so we built a database that had individual profiles of each one of our supporters, as well as voters in general, through consumer profiles, through tax records, through all the things that are legal and decent to collect on people. And that allowed us to determine the most effective message. By doing those analytics, we could deliver it with the most effective tools. Is it a text? Is it an email? Anything like that. And test everything and test often. Because the more you know about the people you already have, the greater likelihood you'll get the people you don't have. And who said that? That was me about 5 seconds ago. And the idea with that is that the more you know about who you already have, that will allow you to spend just enough time to keep them motivated and moving forward, and that frees up the resources to focus on the people you don't have. It's amazing to me how many people don't know a lot about the people they already have. We updated MyBo Dashboard so that virtually everyone in the country would have the same tools. No matter if you had an hour between flights at an airport and you wanted to log on and do some calls, you could do that. and it bridged the online and the offline world. The number of doors you'd knocked on, the number of events you'd attended, the number of emails you had done, it all came together in the updated MyBo Dashboard, which looked basically like that. We had a call tool that was basically built, and I'm wrapping up here, but on peer-to-peer, which was, we would, if you were a veteran, you could log on and say, I have an hour, I want to call 15 veterans in North Carolina, and boom, we would give it to you. No matter where you were in the country, you didn't have to be at home, you could be driving, or anything like that. But we did find that 80% of people did not have a home phone number under the age 30. So this is probably one of the most interesting tools that we developed, and this is the last thing I'll talk about. Targeted sharing was an application that we built for Facebook, and once people downloaded it, it gave the campaign permission to go in and do analytics on their friends. So we would then give them a tool, or we would send them a video link or something and say, you have 5 friends in Ohio that are uncommitted. Here's a tool that we think would be very effective in reaching out to them and persuading them. Back on that idea of personal, back on that idea of self-organization. And the results of it are 600,000 people downloaded that application, and through that touched 5 million people, which I will jump forward and say was our margin of victory. This is the day before Ohio, so here's the president, here's Bruce Springsteen and Jay-Z, all of them coming off calendars of doing their own events. I'm briefing them before they take the stage for our last event in the biggest swing state in American presidential politics. We won. And then very quickly, our metrics, $690 million raised online, a 38% increase of 2008, 4.4 million more donors in 2012 than in 2008. Our Quick Donate SMS tool that I mentioned brought 1.5 million people into the donor pool that weren't there before. The most liked Facebook page ever. Online voter registration jumped by 50%, and 358,000 offline events organized through peoplesmybarackobama.com. 358,000 events of people reaching out to their neighbors and people they go to church with and the people they work with. And what we found is that when all this money was being thrown at us at the end, these hundreds of millions of dollars, it was this personalized outreach that allowed us to penetrate that television media blitz, because it was one person talking to another based on a pre-existing relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Roger Fisk. I do have to ask you, though, thank you very much indeed. I do have to ask you whether you won the campaign or whether Mitt Romney lost it. With, do you remember Clint Eastwood's address to the empty chair? Would you like to do that now? Would you like to counter?
No, I love the empty chair. I want to leave it empty.
But to what extent, because again, as marketers, we're not just relying on the things that we can do to promote our products, we're also looking at what mistakes do the competitors make that we can exploit.
Absolutely, and I'll say this in an analytical sense as opposed to a partisan sense. I think there's demonstrable, measurable ways that we won. And I think there are demonstrable, measurable ways that our opponent lost. For example, their relationship with social media, I think, was decidedly 20th century. Their numbers and how much they were trafficked, to me, didn't speak of an organization that actually wants to inhale and exhale information with people. It spoke to a more monolithic 20th century model of, here's what we stand for, here's our issue papers, without really being interested in a give and take. And then I think Barack Obama is cool and comfortable, and he knows who he is, and he's not trying to be anyone else. And I think it's fair to say that our opponent was not comfortable, and was, especially by virtue of being pulled so far right in the Republican primaries, ended up kind of trying to sell something that he himself didn't really even believe in. He ended up a little bit more right than I think he even was. So I think we actively won, and I think in some ways they actively lost, and it just kind of harmonized in a very beautiful way.
Right. And as marketers, yes, we can. Thank you very much, Roger Fisk.
Thank you. Thank you very much.